In the sweltering heat of a Pennsylvania summer on July the 3rd, 1863, the fields around Gettysburg turned into a slaughterhouse. Thousands of Confederate soldiers, their bayonets glinting under the sun, stepped out from the tree line and marched straight into the jaws of hell. This was Pickett's charge, the desperate gamble that would define the Battle of Gettysburg and, some say, the fate of the Confederacy. But as the smoke cleared and the broken remnants of those brave men staggered back, their commander, General Robert E. Lee, rode out to meet them. What he said in that moment of crushing defeat revealed the heart of a leader burdened by the weight of his choices. This is the story of that day, that charge, and those words, a tale of ambition, tragedy, and the unyielding grip of war. To understand what happened at Gettysburg, we have to step back and see how the pieces fell into place. By the spring of 1863, the American Civil War had dragged on for 2 bloody years. The Union, with its vast resources and growing armies, seemed like an unstoppable machine. But the Confederacy had proven time and again that grit and daring could turn the tide. Robert E. Lee, the aristocratic Virginian who commanded the Army of Northern Virginia, had just pulled off a stunning victory at Chancellorsville in May. There, against overwhelming odds, he'd split his forces and outmaneuvered Union General Joe Hooker, sending the Federals reeling back across the Rappahannock River. It was a masterstroke, but it came at a terrible cost. Lee's right-hand man, Stonewall Jackson, was mortally wounded by friendly fire, a loss that haunted the general like a shadow. Emboldened by Chancellorsville, Lee looked north. The Confederacy needed a win on Union soil, not just for morale, but to sway European powers like Britain and France, who might recognize Southern independence if they saw the North vulnerable. Lee also hoped to relieve pressure on Virginia's farms, ravaged by constant fighting, and perhaps even force a peace negotiation. So in June, he slipped his army, about 75,000 strong, across the Potomac into Maryland and Pennsylvania. They moved like a gray wave, foraging for supplies and dodging Union scouts. Meanwhile, Abraham Lincoln, frustrated with Hooker's hesitation, replaced him with George Meade, a steady if unflashy engineer from Philadelphia. Meade's Army of the Potomac, numbering around 90,000, hurried to intercept Lee, racing through the countryside in a game of cat and mouse. Fate chose Gettysburg as the battlefield, a quiet crossroads town of 2,400 souls, surrounded by rolling hills and farmland. On June 30th, Confederate foragers stumbled into Union cavalry under John Buford, who recognized the high ground south of town, Cemetery Hill, Cemetery Ridge, and the Round Tops, as key terrain. Buford dug in, buying time for reinforcements. The next morning, July 1st, the storm broke. Confederate divisions under A.P. Hill and Richard Ewell pushed in from the west and north, clashing with Union troops in the streets and fields. The fighting was chaotic, men firing from behind fences, charging through orchards, the air thick with powder smoke and screams. By afternoon, the Union lines buckled. They retreated through Gettysburg, a panicked rout that saw soldiers trampled in the narrow alleys. But they reformed in Cemetery Hill, where Winfield Scott Hancock, sent by Meade, organized a defensive line that stretched like a fishhook from Culp's Hill in the east, along Cemetery Ridge, to Little Round Top in the south. That night, Lee arrived on the field. He was 56, silver-haired, with a calm dignity that inspired his men. But without Jackson, he relied on Ewell, who hesitated to assault Cemetery Hill despite orders to take it if practicable. Critics later said Ewell lacked Jackson's fire and that missed opportunity let the Union entrench. As darkness fell, both sides licked their wounds. The Confederates had driven the enemy, but at a price, thousands dead or wounded, including key officers. Meade, arriving late that night, approved Hancock's position and called up more corps. The stage was set for Day 2. July 2nd dawned hot and humid. Lee, ever the aggressor, planned to hit the Union flanks. He sent James Longstreet, his old war horse, to smash the left at Little Round Top and the Peach Orchard, while Ewell attacked the right at Culp's Hill and Cemetery Hill. But Longstreet, a defensive genius who preferred fortified positions, dragged his feet, perhaps deliberately, as he disagreed with Lee's offensive strategy. It wasn't until 4 p.m. that Longstreet's men struck. The fighting was ferocious, a whirlwind of bayonets and canister shot. At Devil's Den, a jumble of boulders, Texans, and Alabamians clawed their way up, only to be met by Union volleys that turned the rocks slick with blood. Nearby, Daniel Sickles, a Union Corps commander with more bravado than sense, had advanced his men into a salient at the Peach Orchard and Wheatfield, exposing them. Confederates poured in, and the fields became killing grounds, men dropping like wheat under a scythe. The crisis came at Little Round Top. If the Confederates took it, they could enfilade the entire Union line. Colonel Joshua Chamberlain's 20th Maine, low on ammo, fixed bayonets and charged downhill, routing the exhausted rebels. It was a close-run thing. Chamberlain later wrote of the whirling death and how his men held by sheer will. On the right, Ewell's attacks gained ground at Culp's Hill, but faltered against dug-in Yankees. By nightfall, the Union held, but barely. Casualties mounted, over 9,000 on each side that day alone. Lee, pacing his headquarters on Seminary Ridge, believed one more push could break Meade. Longstreet urged caution, suggesting a maneuver around the Union left to force Meade to attack. But Lee was resolute. The enemy is there, and I am going to attack him there. Dawn on July 3rd brought no relief from the heat. Union troops reclaimed lost ground at Culp's Hill after a grueling 7-hour scrap, their muskets so hot they burned hands. Lee, undeterred, shifted focus to the center. He ordered a massive artillery barrage to soften Union lines on Cemetery Ridge, followed by an infantry assault. Longstreet would command it, with fresh divisions under George Pickett, a flamboyant Virginian with flowing locks and a flair for drama, plus brigades from Hill's Corps under J. Johnston Pettigrew and Isaac Trimble. In all, about 12,500 men, mostly Virginians, North Carolinians, and Tennesseans. Longstreet protested vehemently. He saw the open field, nearly a mile wide, swept by artillery, as a death trap. "General," he told Lee, "I have been a soldier all my life. It is my opinion that no 15,000 men, ever arrayed for battle, can take that position." But Lee was adamant, perhaps overconfident from past victories, or sensing his army's morale teetering. The bombardment began around 1 p.m., the largest in the war's history. Over 150 Confederate guns thundered, shaking the ground like an earthquake. Shells screamed overhead, exploding among Union troops who hunkered behind stone walls and earthworks. One Yankee described it as hell turned loose, with trees splintered and caissons erupting in flames. But many Confederate shots overshot, landing harmlessly behind the ridge. Union Artillery Chief Henry Hunt conserved ammo, replying sparingly to draw out the barrage. After about 2 hours, the guns fell silent, the air choked with smoke. Longstreet, reluctant, scrawled a note to his artillery commander. "If the artillery fire does not drive the enemy from his position, let the infantry advance." Then came the charge. From the woods on Seminary Ridge, the Confederates emerged in perfect lines, flags fluttering, officers on horseback urging them forward. Pickett's Virginians anchored the right, Pettigrew's men the left, Trimble in support. They dressed ranks, stepping out at a steady pace, about 100 yards per minute, across Emmitsburg Road, through fences that slowed them into the open. It was a sight to behold. One observer called it magnificent, like a parade ground drill turned deadly. But as they closed to 700 yards, Union guns opened up with double canister, ripping gaping holes in the ranks. Men fell in heaps, but the lines closed up, pressing on. At 300 yards, musketry joined in, a storm of lead that one survivor likened to 1,000 hammers beating on 1,000 anvils. The Confederates faltered but pushed. On the left, Pettigrew's brigades shredded under fire from Ohio and New York regiments. Many never reached the wall. Trimble went down wounded. Pickett's men angled right, converging on a copse of trees, the focal point. Lewis Armistead had on his sword tip led a breakthrough over the stone wall, yelling, "Follow me!" A few hundred rebels surged into the Union lines, hand-to-hand chaos with clubbed muskets and bayonets. But reinforcements, Vermonters flanking, fresh brigades rushing in, sealed the breach. Armistead fell mortally wounded, touching a Union cannon in defiance. Within minutes, it was over. The survivors fled back, leaving the field carpeted with bodies. Of Pickett's division, 2/3 were lost, all 15 regimental commanders down. Total Confederate casualties, over 6,000 in less than an hour. Union losses were lighter, about 1,500. As the shattered remnants streamed back, Lee rode out on his gray horse, Traveler, hat in hand, to rally them. He moved among the men, calm amid the panic, his voice steady. To one group he said, "All good men must rally. We want all good and true men just now." To a colonel, "Rally your men and protect the artillery. The fault is mine." But the words that echoed most were to the soldiers themselves. "It's all my fault," he repeated over and over. "It is I who have lost this fight." One aide recalled Lee saying, "This has been my fight, and upon my shoulders rests the blame." To Pickett, staggering back with what was left of his command, Lee urged, "General Pickett, place your division in rear of this hill and be ready to repel the advance of the enemy should they follow up their advantage." Pickett, heartbroken, replied bitterly, "General Lee, I have no division." Years later, Pickett would confide to friends that old man had my division slaughtered, a resentment that lingered until his death. Lee's admission was no empty gesture. He took full responsibility, sparing his subordinates. In the moment, it steadied the army. Men who might have broken found strength in their general's poise. But inside, Lee was shattered. That night, as rain poured down, he began planning their treat. On July 4th, Independence Day, the armies stared at each other across the blood-soaked fields. But Meade, cautious as ever, didn't pursue aggressively. Lee's wagons, loaded with wounded, stretched 17 miles on the road to Virginia. The retreat was miserable, mud-choked roads, ambushes by Union cavalry, but Lee got most of his army across the Potomac by July 14th. The battle's toll was staggering, 51,000 casualties total, the war's bloodiest. Gettysburg, combined with Grant's capture of Vicksburg on the same day, marked a turning point. Confederate hopes for invasion crumbled. No foreign aid came. Morale in the South dipped, while the North surged with resolve. Lincoln, dedicating the cemetery there in November, captured the spirit, a new birth of freedom. Lee offered his resignation to Jefferson Davis on August 8th, writing, "I have been prompted by these reflections more than once since my return from Pennsylvania to propose to Your Excellency the propriety of selecting another commander." Davis refused, but Lee was never the same. His health declined. His army bled by attrition. Why did Lee order the charge? Some historians point to overconfidence after Chancellorsville, or misjudging Union strength. Longstreet blamed poor reconnaissance. Ewell's hesitation on day one loomed large. Others see it as desperation. Lee knew his army couldn't sustain a prolonged campaign in the North. Whatever the reason, Pickett's charge became legend, the high water mark of the Confederacy, where Southern dreams crested and receded. In the years after, veterans debated its glory. Virginians claimed the honors, downplaying contributions from other states, fueling post-war feuds. Pickett himself burnished his image, but the charge's fame grew through memoirs and reunions, romanticized in books and films as a chivalric last stand. Yet beneath the myth lies the raw truth. Good men died for a flawed cause, led by a general who, in defeat, showed profound humanity. Lee's words, "It's all my fault," weren't just an apology. They were an acknowledgment of leadership's burden. In a war full of bluster and blame, he owned the pain. Today, walking those fields, you can almost hear the echoes, the thunder of guns, the cries of the fallen, and one man's quiet confession amid the ruins. Gettysburg reminds us that history isn't just dates and battles. It's the choices we make and the words we say when everything falls apart. History rarely ends where the story stops. Its consequences continue long after the final chapter is written. Until next time on Deep History Bite.